At the edge of an irrigation canal in Babylon, on a day that began like any other in exile, a man stopped walking. He was 30 years old, he was a priest of Israel, and he was more than 1,200 kilometers away from the only place where, according to everything he had learned since childhood, the presence of God could appear. What he saw next was so radically impossible to put into words that, across 48 verses of the first chapter of the book that bears his name, he used the expression like or resembling more than 25 consecutive times. It was not poetry. It was not a rhetorical device. It was the honest and desperate confession of a man who tried, with all the force of the most precise Hebrew language he had at his disposal, to describe something that the Hebrew language, or any human language, had simply not been built to contain. His name was Ezekiel, son of Buzi. From the priestly family of Zadok, the line that traced back to Aaron himself, that had served Solomon, that had guarded the temple for generations. Ezekiel was not a visionary from the margins. He was not a self-appointed prophet without credentials. He was a rigorously trained priest, prepared for a precise ministry in a specific place, the temple in Jerusalem, with a liturgy that had been codified over centuries. 30 years old, that detail seems minor. It is not. In Israelite law, specifically in the texts of Numbers chapter 4, 30 years was the sacred threshold, the age at which a man of Levitical lineage entered full priestly function. Before 30, a Levite could assist, could learn, could observe. After 30, he assumed his role. 30 years was the real beginning. It was the year in which a lifetime of preparation, study, memorization, ritual training, liturgical learning finally converted into active purpose within the sanctuary. Ezekiel had spent his entire life waiting for that age, and the year he reached it, the temple was 1,200 kilometers away in Babylonian hands, and he was at the edge of an irrigation canal in the middle of Mesopotamia. The year was the 5th of the captivity of King Jehoiakim, in Hebrew Jehoiakim, also called Jeconiah, which places Ezekiel's vision around 593 before Christ. Nebuchadnezzar the Coup had carried out the second great deportation from Jerusalem in 598 before Christ. In that mass deportation, he had not taken the poorest, he had taken the most valuable: priests, artisans, elite soldiers, scribes, nobles, those whom a capital needed in order to function. Nebuchadnezzar's policy was not gratuitous destruction, it was the transplantation of competence, weakening Jerusalem by taking its best minds and most skilled hands to strengthen Babylon. Ezekiel had arrived in that deportation, with 30 years still ahead of him. The Kebar Canal, in Hebrew Nhar Kebar, was not a natural river. It was one of the great artificial irrigation canals that cut through the plain of Lower Mesopotamia, derived from the Euphrates. Babylonian cuneiform records of the period mention a canal with a similar name, the Naru Kabari, which served as a hydraulic artery for the region around Nippur, approximately 80 kilometers southeast of Babylon. It was a working canal, wide enough for cargo vessels, with banks of wet clay, smelling of silt and Euphrates sediment, surrounded by the irrigation fields that Babylonian engineering had transformed into one of the most productive agricultural regions of the ancient world. And at the banks of that canal, the Israelite deportees had built their settlement. The place was called Tel Abib, in Hebrew Tel Abib, which literally means hill of spring. Archaeologists identify the tells, the artificial mounds formed by the accumulation of ruins from earlier settlements, as the sites where civilizations succeeded one another at the same geographic point. Tel Abib was probably one of those places, a mound over the ruins of something earlier. where the exiled Israelites had built clay houses, had planted gardens, had tried to recreate with the available materials something that resembled a life. Can you imagine the specific weight that rested on Ezekiel in that context? Not just the weight of exile, the longing for Jerusalem, the distance from the family that had been left behind, the loss of familiar roots, of ancestral cemeteries, of the streets where he had grown up. There was an even greater, more specific weight, which was the weight of a priest without a temple. Ezekiel's identity was structurally bound to a physical place that was now inaccessible. His professional purpose, his vocation, his role within the community, all of it depended on an architecture that was 1,200 kilometers away, and that, for all practical purposes, might as well have been in another universe. And there was the theological question that gnawed at all of them. Where was God? It was not a rhetorical question. It was an existential crisis with concrete implications for every aspect of Israelite religious life. The entire theology of the temple had been built on a fundamental premise. The Shekinah, the tangible divine presence, dwelt in Jerusalem. Specifically, in the Kebar, the Holy of Holies, between the cherubim that covered the Ark of the Covenant with their golden wings. The temple was not merely a symbol, it was God's address. It was where sacrifices arrived, where prayer had a guaranteed reception, where the priest entered once a year on Yom Kippur to encounter the presence more directly than any other living human being could encounter it. And then Nebuchadnezzar burned the temple. What had happened to the Shekinah? Had it remained in the rubble? Had it been captured along with the golden and silver vessels? Had it simply ceased? The crisis of exile was not political, it was metaphysical, and there was no theological language available yet to answer it satisfactorily. There is a specific detail in the vision that Ezekiel recorded that day, an element that appears in the first verses of chapter 1 and that scholars of diverse traditions still debate with intensity, that will answer that question in a way no one was expecting. But to reach it, you first need to see what Ezekiel saw. And seeing what Ezekiel saw is not simple. It was on the 5th day of the 4th month of the 5th year of Jehoiakim's captivity. Ezekiel was at the edge of the Kebar. The text does not say what he was doing, whether he was walking, fishing, or simply sitting in the heavy silence of yet another afternoon in exile. And then the sky changed. Not the way the sky changes when an ordinary storm approaches. The way the sky changes when something that has no name in any human language begins to draw near. And I looked, and behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with fire flashing forth continually, and a brightness around it, and in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal, a stormy wind, ruach sarah in Hebrew, the same expression used in the book of Job to describe the wind from which God speaks to the patriarch at the end of that book. Not just any wind, a directional storm with purpose, coming from a specific point on the horizon, from the north. In any culture of the ancient Near East, the north carried immense symbolic weight. It was from the north that empires came. Assyria, Babylon, all descended through the Syrian-Palestinian corridor from the north. It was also, in Israelite cosmology, the direction associated with the divine mountain, the Tzafon, the mountain of God, which appears in the Psalms as a synonym for the heavenly dwelling. A stormy wind from the north was not merely a meteorological phenomenon. It was a declaration of origin. The cloud was not static. The fire within it was not the fire of an ordinary flame. The text says it revolved, agitated, folded back upon itself like an entity with its own movement. Around all of it there was a brightness, nogah in Hebrew, a radiant glow that the word also uses to describe the rising sun and the light of lightning. And at the core of that luminous storm was the hashmal. Hashmal is one of the most debated words in biblical Hebrew. It appears only 3 times in the entire Bible. The Greek translators of the Septuagint rendered it as electron, which in Greek meant both amber and the gold-silver alloy called electrum. Medieval translators used amber. Modern ones disagree among themselves. What the word seems to indicate is a substance that emits its own light, that does not merely reflect light, but produces it from within, a color that glows from the inside out. How does one paint in words a color that never existed before a single text recorded it? How does one instruct the mind to hold an image for which it has no file? From the midst of the hashmail came 4 living creatures. The Hebrew text calls them chayot, plural of chaya, which simply means living being, animated creature. It does not use a special word. It does not invent a name for them. It calls them by the most generic name possible for a thing that lives. As if any more specific name would already be an unacceptable limitation on what was being described. Each one had a human appearance, but each one had 4 faces. Consider what that means in terms of the geometry of perception. A human face looking forward, a lion's face to the right, an ox's face to the left, an eagle's face behind, per being. 16 faces in total for the 4 creatures, looking simultaneously in 4 directions, covering all quadrants of whatever space they inhabited. No direction was uncovered. No angle was a blind spot. Wherever you looked from the center of that formation, there was a face looking back at you. What those 4 faces represented in the iconography of the ancient Near East was not arbitrary. The lion was the king of wild animals, power, sovereignty, noble ferocity. The ox was the greatest of domestic animals, labor strength, sacrifice, sustenance. The man was the apex of conscious creation, reason, language, moral intention. The eagle was the king of birds, sharp vision, speed, the capacity to see from height what is invisible from the ground. The 4 forms of powerful existence that antiquity had mapped, gathered in 4 beings that were, at the same time, all of them. How can a single creature be simultaneously a lion, an ox, a man and an eagle, without any of the 4 cancelling the others, without the presence of one erasing the reality of the rest? Each being had 4 wings. 2 covered their bodies, a gesture of reverence or concealment that will appear later in the cherubim of the temple and in Isaiah's seraphim, who also cover their bodies in the divine presence. The other 2 wings were extended horizontally, touching the wings of the adjacent beings. The 4 creatures formed a square, and their extended wings created the ceiling of a chamber, an enclosed space between them, with the firmament above and the ground below. Their legs were straight. The text literally says they had a straight leg, with no yielding joint, no bending knee. And their feet, the text describes them as like the sole of a calf's foot, were rounded. They gleamed like polished bronze, like the shine of bronze burnished to perfection. Below their wings on each side, there were human hands. 4 creatures, 4 wings each. 1 human hand beneath each wing, 16 human hands belonging to beings that were not human. What crosses your mind when you try to visualize that? Human hands, with the proportions and the delicacy and the immediate recognition that human hands carry, emerging from the bodies of creatures with 4 faces and calf's feet, and bronze gleaming at their shins. Between the 4 beings there were burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches. The fire went up and down between them, and from the fire came lightning, not the familiar electrical discharge anyone has seen during a summer rainstorm, but something the text suggests as an emanation of the fire, as a natural extension of what was happening at the center of the formation. And now comes the detail of movement that will disturb anyone who stops to think about it carefully. The beings moved without turning. What living being do you know that can travel in any direction without needing to reorient its axis? What is the geometry of a body that has no preferred front, that is front in all directions at the same time? Whatever direction they needed to travel, they traveled, without reorienting the body, without turning, without doing what any physical being you know needs to do to change direction. Wherever the Spirit went, they went directly. The text repeats this. It repeats that they did not turn when they walked, as if the concepts of front and back, of preferred direction, of orientation axis, as if those concepts simply did not apply to them in the way they apply to anything that exists within known physical categories. Follow the logic of what that implies. A car turns with a steering wheel. A boat turns with a rudder. A person turns with their feet and hips. A bird turns with its wings. Directional movement presupposes an orientation axis, a front that leads the displacement. These beings had none. Or rather, they had four fronts simultaneously. For them, any direction was forward. The sound of their wings when they moved was like the sound of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the thunder of a military encampment on the march. Ezekiel is piling up comparisons because none of them is sufficient. The sound was as vast as the ocean, and as specific as a voice, and as collective as an army, at the same time. A sound that was all these things together, but was not completely any of them. Can you grasp what it would mean to be at the edge of an irrigation canal, alone, and hear a sound that is simultaneously an ocean, a voice, and an army? And then Ezekiel looked down at the ground, at the earth at the edge of the Kebar, and saw what would transform his vision into one of the most studied texts in the intellectual history of humanity. There was a wheel beside each living creature, on the ground next to each being. 4 wheels for 4 creatures. And the appearance of the wheels and their construction, says the text, were like the color of beryl, the semi-precious stone of a blue-green hue, translucent, gleaming in sunlight like deep water. But they were not simple wheels. Each of the 4 wheels had inside it another wheel, a wheel within a wheel, ofen betok ofen in Hebrew, perpendicular to the first, like 2 rings of a gyroscope superimposed in different planes, forming together a spherical movement structure that could roll in any direction, forward, backward, sideways, diagonally, without needing a preferred axis, without needing to reorient. Where did the mental geometry to conceive of something like this come from? In 593 before Christ, in Babylon, the rims of the wheels were high. Awesome, says the text. And they were full of eyes all around. On all 4 wheels, along the entire circumference of the rims, there were eyes. Not 2 eyes, not 8. A surface of eyes, covering the entire borders of all 4 wheels. Eyes that saw in all directions at the same time, that did not need to turn to cover any angle of the surrounding space. An object that sees in all directions, that rolls without an axis, that carries within itself another version of itself. What the records show is that the wheels were not controlled by the creatures in the conventional sense of control. The text says that the spirit of the creatures was in the wheels. Ruach HaChayot, the spirit, the breath, the animating intention of the living beings, was also inside the wheels. Not the creatures managing the wheels like a pilot manages a plane. The creatures and the wheels sharing the same animating impulse, the same ruach, the same directionality. When the creatures stopped, the wheels stopped. When they rose up, the wheels rose up. When they advanced, the wheels advanced, without anyone needing to give a separate instruction to the 2 systems, as if the 2 systems were, in reality, one system alone. And here is the core of the detail that 2,600 years of scholars still debate. Not the anatomical detail of the creatures, not the geometry of the wheels themselves, but the question that all that celestial machinery answers indirectly. Why was the chariot here? Follow the theological reasoning the vision imposes. The wheels exist because the chariot, the Merkaba, as Jewish tradition will come to call this structure, needs to move, can move, is equipped to move in any direction without prior preparation, without local infrastructure, without any of the prerequisites that temple theology had established as necessary for the divine presence. It did not need an altar. It did not need an anointed priest. It did not need incense. It did not need the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy of Holies or Jerusalem. It needed wheels, and the wheels were there. What few realize is that this was a theological revolution with the same impact for 6th century before Christ Judaism that a magnitude 8 earthquake would have on local geology. The crisis of exile was precisely the crisis of where God was. And the vision at the Kebar answered that question not with a verbal declaration, not with a text of consolation, but with a functional image. The presence was here because the chariot had wheels and the wheels could go anywhere. The God of Israel had followed his people to Babylon. Consider what that perception cost for the Orthodox Israelite theology of the time. The entire religious architecture, the temple as divine dwelling, Jerusalem as the city of God, the priesthood as indispensable mediation, presupposed a certain location of the presence, that God was in a place because he had chosen to be in that place. The chariot with wheels did not destroy that theology, but it expanded it in a way that it would never again be possible to fold back into the previous box. If the presence could appear at the Kebar with all the fullness of glory, with the impossible escort of the creatures and the wheels and the eyes on every surface, then the destruction of the temple had not been the end of the presence. It had been its liberation from a geographical limitation that humans had built around it without realizing they were building a cage. It would take centuries to be completely digested, but the seed was planted at the edge of an irrigation canal in 593 before Christ. Above the creatures was the rakia, the firmament, the expanse, the same word used in Genesis to describe what God created on the second day, the separation between the waters above and below, like the color of awesome crystal spread out over the heads of the creatures. Awesome not in the sense of bad, awesome in the sense that Portuguese has lost, of provoking physical reverence, of the body responding to it before the mind can process it. Transparent as crystal, but awesome. And below that firmament the wings of the creatures extended, each pair of wings touching the pair of the adjacent being. The sound that came from beneath the firmament when the creatures moved was like the sound of many waters, like the voice of the Almighty. But when the creatures stopped, when they lowered their wings, there was silence. And from the silence came a voice from above the firmament, above the awesome crystal, above the space where the creatures and wheels and fire existed. There was something that appeared to be a sapphire stone, the deepest blue that antiquity knew as a symbol of royalty and divinity, the lapis lazuli that came from Afghanistan, traversing trade routes of more than 5,000 kilometers to reach the palaces of the Near East, the stone that Moses and the 70 elders of Israel had seen beneath the feet of God on Sinai, according to Exodus chapter 24. Upon the sapphire stone was the likeness of a throne, and upon the likeness of a throne was the likeness of a human form up there on high. Witness the exact moment when Ezekiel realizes what he is describing. He had described creatures with 4 faces each. He had described wheels with eyes. He had described the crystal firmament. And now there was a figure, something with human appearance, seated above all of that. And what Ezekiel does next is perhaps the deepest gesture of intellectual honesty in all of biblical prophetic narrative. He does not say what he saw. He says what it appeared to be. From the appearance of his loins upward, there was something like the color of amber with the appearance of fire all around within. From the appearance of his loins downward, there was something like the appearance of fire with brightness all around. amber with fire, fire with brightness. And around all of it, around the figure, the throne, the firmament, the creatures, the wheels, there was something that Ezekiel describes thus: like the appearance of the rainbow that is in the cloud on a rainy day. A rainbow, the symbol that appears for the first time in the Bible in Genesis chapter 9, the bow that God places in the clouds after the flood, as a sign of the covenant with Noah and with all creation, the symbol that appeared after destruction, after the water that wiped out the former world, as a promise that it would never again be permitted to become a total extinction. And now that same bow framed the glory that Ezekiel saw at the edge of the Kebar, after the destruction of Jerusalem, after the flood of exile, around the chariot that had followed the people to Babylon. The text does not say that Ezekiel saw the glory of God. It says he saw the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord, 3 layers of linguistic distance between the observer and the object observed. Appearance, not the thing, but how it seems. Likeness, not the real thing, but something resembling it. Glory, and even that word is an approximation for kavod, the weight, the presence that bends the space around itself. As if the text itself knew that language does not reach, and therefore piled up approximations instead of attempting a direct description that would inevitably be false. What does it mean that the Hebrew word for divine presence is literally weight? That tradition did not choose light, did not choose voice, did not choose heat. It chose weight. When Ezekiel saw this, he fell with his face to the ground. There is no negotiation in that phrase. There is no resistance. There is no deliberation of a man deciding what the appropriate response is for that moment. The body of Ezekiel, which had been trained for the temple, which had memorized liturgies, which knew exactly what the ritual protocol was for every occasion, simply resolved on its own what to do before the appearance of the likeness of the glory. And what the body knew how to do was the only gesture that still made sense: to fall. And then there was a voice, not described in its sonic attributes, not qualified in tone or volume. Only there was a voice. Son of man, stand on your feet, and I will speak with you. Ben Adam, Son of man. The form of address that God will use with Ezekiel 93 times throughout the entire book, more than with any other prophet. A form that affirms the humanity of the prophet at the very moment he experiences something beyond the human scale. You are human. Stand on your feet. Let us talk. And the Spirit entered Ezekiel and set him on his feet. Not Ezekiel rising, the Spirit setting Ezekiel on his feet. The distinction is important because the text suggests the initiative was not human. The body had reached its limit and needed something external to function again. The commission that followed was that of a tzofeh, in Hebrew, a watchman, a man placed on the highest tower of the city to see what comes from afar before it arrives, with the specific responsibility to warn, and with the equally specific warning that the people to whom he would speak were described as a rebellious house, with eyes to see, but that did not see, with ears to hear, but that did not hear. Ezekiel's mission was not comfortable. It was not popular. It was necessary. The text of Ezekiel chapters 2 and 3 describes that after the verbal commission, a scroll, a parchment, was unrolled before the prophet, filled with writing on the inside and outside, lamentations and mourning and woe. And the voice said, "Eat this scroll." And Ezekiel ate it, and in his mouth it was sweet as honey. The prophet ate the message of lamentation, and it was sweet. The paradox of that detail still disturbs any reader who stops to think about it. A message of disaster, swallowed, tasting of honey. As if the word, even when its content would be bitter for those who would hear it, had an intrinsic flavor that was independent of its theme. And then Ezekiel went to Tel Abib, where the exiles lived, and sat there overwhelmed for 7 days. 7 days. The 7 in Israel was never merely a quantity, it was a symbol of completeness, the cycle that closes, the period that concludes, the number that defines the sacred week and the Sabbath and the Jubilee. 7 days of creation, 7 days of mourning for the dead, 7 days of purification after ritual impurity. 7 days before a priest entered full function, as in Leviticus 8. Ezekiel remained in silence for 7 days, as if what he had experienced needed a sacred period to settle before it could be transmitted. 7 days at the edge of the canal, in silence, among compatriots who did not know what had happened to him. What passes through the mind of a man who has just seen creatures with 16 faces and wheels with eyes, and a figure of fire upon a sapphire throne and a rainbow, and who is now sitting among neighbors who ask whether he wants some bread? And what the records show is that when that 7-day period ended, when the silence converted into speech, Ezekiel became the most prolific prophet of the exile. 48 chapters, more than 1,200 verses, the most architectonically detailed description of the temple that the entire Bible contains, with precise measurements of every chamber, every altar, every porch, every wall. Visions of a valley full of dry bones gathering together and being covered with tendons and flesh and receiving the breath of life. Rivers of water issuing from the threshold of the temple and growing until they could not be crossed on foot. The restoration of Israel described with topographical precision that still guides modern archaeologists. The 7 days of silence did not produce fewer words. It produced an entire volume. There is a datum about the reception of the book of Ezekiel in Jewish tradition that reveals more about the weight of this vision than any academic analysis could reveal. At some point between the 2nd and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the sages of the Talmud established that chapter 1 of Ezekiel, the vision of the chariot, the Merkabah, should not be taught publicly to more than one person at a time, and that person needed to already be an established scholar of mature judgment before being exposed to the text. The logic was not that the text was heretical or forbidden. It was that it was too powerful to be accessed without preparation, like high voltage on exposed wires, not because electricity is evil, but because the power was incompatible with contact without protection. Generations of intellects among the sharpest in Jewish history, Maimonides, Rashi, Nachmanides, the authors of the Hekkelot, the texts of the heavenly palaces that form the core of Merkabah mysticism, spent decades building upon that foundation. The entire tradition of chariot mysticism, which would become one of the pillars of medieval Kabbalah, starts from the first chapter of Ezekiel. The vision of the Kebar became the engine room of one of the most enduring intellectual currents in human history, not despite its opacity, but because of it. It was studied precisely because it resisted being completely studied. And then, in the year 95 or 96 of the Common Era, on a Mediterranean island, a man in a different exile saw something. John the Apostle, in Revelation chapter 4, describes around the throne of God 4 living creatures, the first like a lion, the second like an ox, the third with a human face, the fourth like a flying eagle, full of eyes inside and out, with 6 wings each, and day and night they never cease saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. 600 years separate Ezekiel from John. One was at the Kebar in Mesopotamia. The other was at Patmos in the Aegean. One was a priest of the line of Zadok. The other was a fisherman from the Sea of Galilee transformed into an apostle. Different cultures, different centuries, different geographies, and both saw the same 4 creatures. It is not that John copied Ezekiel. The 2 texts have sufficient differences to eliminate the hypothesis of simple literary dependence. It is that both describe the same object from observation points separated by 600 years and 3,000 kilometers. like two cameras positioned in different locations, capturing the same event, and the images, when compared, confirming that the event existed independently of either observer. The visual influence of Ezekiel's vision on Western art is so deep and so diffuse that you carry it without knowing where it comes from. The four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were associated from the 2nd century of the Common Era by Irenaeus of Lyon and later by Jerome, with the four faces of the creatures of the Kebar. The man for Matthew, because his gospel begins with the human genealogy of Jesus. The lion for Mark, because his narrative begins in the desert with the voice that cries out. The ox for Luke, because it begins in the temple with the sacrifice of Zechariah. The eagle for John, because his prologue begins before time, on high, with "in the beginning was the Word." The next time you enter a medieval European cathedral, or see an illumination from a 12th century manuscript, or observe the portal of a Romanesque basilica, and find a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle arranged around a central figure, you will be looking at the iconography that was born at the edge of the Kebar, at the creatures that Ezekiel saw at the edge of a Babylonian irrigation canal in 593 before Christ, 1,200 kilometers from the temple, on pagan territory, in forced exile, without altar, without ark, without the infrastructure that was supposed to be necessary, and the chariot appeared anyway. The 30-year-old priest who had arrived in exile with his entire life, organized around a purpose that exile had made impossible. That man, at the edge of a muddy canal in the Mesopotamian plain, received the vision that no priest of the temple in Jerusalem had ever recorded receiving within its sacred walls. The presence had not remained in the rubble. It had not been defeated alongside the city walls. It had gone along. The wheels had rolled to where the people had been taken. 2,600 years later, Ezekiel's 7 days of silence at the edge of the Kebar still make more sense than anything anyone could have said.